You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
Psychedelics prescribed by physicians, antihistamines for premenstrual disorder, real-time insights into clinical trials as they're happening. These may sound like hypotheticals, but they're actually recent headlines you might have seen on your newsfeed. Welcome to Beyond the Endpoint. I'm Dr. Emily O'Brien.
And I'm Dr. Manesh Patel, and you're listening to Beyond the Headlines, the series where we take recent health and science stories like the ones you just heard and look past the splashy findings to the evidence, the uncertainty, and the real world implications for patients, researchers, and health systems.
That's right. And, we have some splashiness today, Manesh. We have a great list. So let's get right to it. I know you have been spending some time reading about and thinking about this new initiative that the FDA has going on to speed up clinical trials, which I guess are known for being less efficient than they should be. Fair?
Yeah, fair. I mean, I wish we could get answers faster, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're all for faster and better clinical trials. And in fact, I think there was a Stat News article from our FDA Commissioner Marty McCary and others talking about smarter real-time clinical trials and how they could help drug discovery and drug development. And I think for a lot of the work we've talked about, like we want it, but how does it actually happen? They announced what they called a bold new approach where they could transform clinical trials and research by getting real-time information. So part of what they're talking about is the ability both potentially while the trials are going on or even after the trials are complete and we're thinking about phase 4 sort of monitoring, looking at endpoints in the cloud as they occur is what they've described. Or another way of thinking about it is if you actually had a feed from health systems to understand if it was de-identified where you could bring information in areas where patients are getting exposed to different types of therapies, if that would help us see these endpoints sooner, that might make a difference. And so their at least announcement was that they are working on clinical trials more efficiently with real-time data from trials conducted by AstraZeneca and Amgen, where I think they're looking to make sure that when a patient's in the clinical trial and they develop a fever or they're hospitalized or they have some other measure like an imaging study showing the tumor regresses, according to Dr. McCary, that the FDA could see it and start to understand the findings better. Now, Emily, you've thought a lot about real world data and observational information and other data sources. What are your thoughts about this sort of announcement from the agency?
It's a Monday, so maybe I'm just like glass half empty today, but I'm skeptical. I will say this is a critical need. Like we have been saying this for a long time. How do we do things better, faster? I worry about over responsiveness. As we all know, you conduct these studies, and sometimes the early signals don't pan out. And that's where our brilliant statistician friends come in and help us try to work through that signal to noise ratio question. But I guess, what I'm really hungry for after reading this summary and sort of hearing you talk about it is that it still feels pretty aspirational. I mean, they haven't really address some of the kind of inherent challenges with things like data standardization and integration and even boring stuff like what are the right diagnostic codes to use to identify a stroke in real time. So it sounds great. I love the attention that it's getting, but I think it's time for a real plan for how is this actually going to look different than what we're doing now before I'll get really excited about this as a major step forward.
Some of the things they've described where an AI could be reading and looking through the chart to identify the tumor has shrunk, et cetera. There's so much to that statement. I wish it was straightforward, but I do believe the tools that we have coming are going to move us forward. So I guess I'll say I want to see it work. I really do. And I think it's an important issue. The interoperability, the ability to get the tools in, the ability to safely have that in a way that the FDA values will be exciting to see. So I'll lean into it, but I agree with you that I'll have at least a healthy sense of skepticism till we get there. Talk about healthy sense of skepticism. The next one that you had makes me wonder about it. I think it's a good thing, but psychedelics in medicine. Tell me how we got here and what we're up to.
I'll say it's not a new topic. It's certainly been a topic of discussion in clinical research for a while now, but there's some common elements to the topic on speeding up clinical research. And in fact, for this specific domain, it seems like accelerated access is going to be a possibility in the very near future. So the recent development is that Trump signed an executive order on April 18th that basically signaled that psychedelic research is now a federal priority. And the domains of focus, there have been a lot of them on, online that people have talked about, but the ones that have been highlighted by the administration are depression, PTSD, addiction. I think this has been a priority for many different groups, including veterans and others, where we do see a higher burden of conditions like PTSD. And there's really a lot of motivation to find something that actually works long term and lessen suffering in these groups. So I think there's overall support for moving things forward. But what the executive order will actually do is to open a right to try pathway so people who are seriously ill can have access to these investigational psychedelics before they've gone through the full years long approval process. They're also giving about $50 million to ARPA-H to fund research and then have a few states that are matching investments as well to accelerate our understanding of these therapies and how they work in different populations and benefits and risks.
I find that I'm actually excited that this has been signed because do think both PTSD, mental health disorders, severe depression could certainly use more scientific inquiry. And these compounds for many years have been at least touted to say that they can really make a difference in people's lives. And there are some real powerful anecdotal stories around that. So, in some ways, I was sort of joking about it, but I actually am excited and I hope that we can get towards studying all kinds of therapies. My big thing will be, can we make sure that the science is as rigorous as one would want compared to other therapeutics?
And that's why I think this step, even though it's a little unconventional since it's moving with an executive order, like this is the right time, I think, for us to get serious about this domain of research. There's a lot of work out there looking at this, but as you said, it tends to be more anecdotal, a little bit messier, smaller trials. It's challenging to blind people feel the effects of these drugs. And so the placebo effects are a real challenge. And so that's why I think, it does make sense at this point in time to take a step back and say, hey, we're seeing a lot of signals, but like, let's get really robust about this. I think there's still some remaining safety questions, especially around, potential cardiac risks. And we just don't have large scale data sets that collect what we need yet to really help us understand whether those signals are real. And so I think most people are pretty excited about the chance to address some open questions around things like long term effects. And it'll really be a nice opportunity for us to address that question. Is this hype or does this really pan out when we look at this under rigorous experimental design conditions?
Yeah, and I think everything from dose response to the way it happens, the way that side effects and/or benefits exist will be really critical. So I'm excited for it, and I'm glad that at least this is the time that we're gonna try to go tackle it.
You've also been reading a lot about CAR T, another exciting area of drug development for autoimmune diseases. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, because when you hear about CAR T and things like that, you're not always sure what that may mean. CAR T cell therapy is a way in which we try to reprogram cells to use the immune system to attack disease. It's really transformed at least certain types of cancers where people might have a cancer cell and they go through a process by which T cells, which are immune cells, are actually reprogrammed to potentially attack and kill the cancer cells. And that's powerful. This usually requires taking cells from the patient, T cells, genetically modifying them, and then putting them back in the patient's body. So sometimes when you'll hear about people saying, "Oh, I'm going to get cell therapy for cancer," that's how people have thought about it. Now, recently, a lot of groups have been thinking about, instead of having to take them out and do this stuff to them and put them back in, can you modify those cells while they're still in the person's body? And can that then help with not just cancer, but autoimmune disease and other things? And CAR T is also being thought about for that. So that's the first big step. The second step in thinking about how do you genetically modify or modify these cells is, historically we've sort of had two versions. We've had like a where we give something called an adenovirus, and actually a Duke researcher named Arvind Ashokin's been sort of a leader in that, where you get these adenoviruses. They're sort of modified so they don't get you infected, but they bring this DNA to the cell and they may modify the cell. So you give them person this virus and it takes the DNA and it modifies the DNA. The second is something we talked about, I think, on this show and others, the CRISPR Cas9 revolution with Jevner Verdowna's sort of Nobel laureate work, saying there's sort of like decoding tail on DNA in places where you can marker and go and actually with precision snip and edit DNA. And so together, what recently was identified is that you could think about doing both, maybe not just CRISPR, but could use the viruses and CRISPR together to go modify T cells. Now, that's a super complex way of thinking about things that you probably haven't, but I think the real exciting part of this is that we're getting closer and closer to thinking about ways in which we modify your own immune system at times to help with disorders like cancer or immune disorders. And that may be something we can do by modifying the T cells and CAR T cell sort of therapy that I've described.
If you sort of zoom out, Manesh, I mean, it sounds like some preliminary kind of promise, certainly need more work in this area. Do you think it has any implications for what we might consider the average person with an autoimmune condition right now? How does it impact how they think about their condition and what the options are?
Yeah, one of the things that in the past made CAR T really hard to do was that you had to go and literally blood and cells are taken from your body. They go through a process and they're coming back and injected. And you had to have a variety of things to get that to happen. You could imagine if this is proven, and I just want to be clear that we still have to get through all the process of making sure they have the right receptor, they can go to the cell we want, they can modify the cell we're thinking about. But you start to democratize access to potentially a transformative therapy. You start to have a way in which patients who might have a variety of immune or cancer disorders might be able to get reprogrammed immune cells like the T cells to affect their immune system. And again, obviously there's some steps in science that have to happen here, but I find that one of the brilliances and joys of being at an academic institution is somebody thinking a little bit outside the box saying, hey, why don't we try to do that? And then, oh, look, somebody described this. And I think that's part of what we're seeing here. And it's also part of the first story, right? Like that you were talking about were psychedelics. Like that's an unmet need, and so how do you build an innovation where maybe you need now health policy and science to work together? So for me, this story was really exciting just because, oh, wow, you could do CAR T, and we've been doing that for cancer. Oh, wow, you could do viral infected editing DNA. Oh, you could do CRISPR. What if we did all of it, and now you don't have to take the blood out, but you're using the CAR T mechanism and you're editing the DNA? Like, so that's where I see the stepwise innovation. Now, for an individual with autoimmune or cancer diagnoses, they're still probably a ways away from seeing some of this, but the concept that we've moved forward is pretty exciting. And so a little bit of a dork out on CAR T, and I'm a cardiologist, so everything I've said could be wrong. I'm just telling you that's like my understanding of it. So it's just like one level above what ChatGPT, or maybe exactly at the level of ChatGPT these days. I don't know, but highlight it just to say that's how I think about it. And the human exciting part about it is, oh yeah, this is how people are putting things together to get to solutions.
So I don't know that we identified this as like our explicit theme for this episode, but our last topic actually fits very nicely into that bucket that you described of like, oh, well, we're looking in one direction and then another direction. We see some things that maybe we wouldn't have considered as an approach to this really thorny problem. And somehow there seems to be something that works. So I'll just start off and ask you, have you seen any of the viral claims around antihistamines for PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, on TikTok or Instagram or wherever you spend your social media time?
I have to be honest, it might be the algorithm. I wasn't seeing a lot of this till you guys mentioned it to me, but then I started seeing more of it. So I don't know if it was because I started looking to understand it or not, but I'd be interested what your take is because I've seen a few people, again, anecdotally saying it's making a difference.
I was surprised to find out about this as well. The way I found out about this topic was through Zach Rubin, who was on the podcast, brilliant allergist, a really thoughtful guy. People were sending him this question of like, hey, can I use antihistamines for PMDD? And so he spent some time kind of looking into the topic and did a nice overview. So I encourage people to check that out. It's actually fairly simple. So it's this claim that antihistamines, so things like Zyrtec or Allegra or Pepcid, can treat premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is a severe cyclic mood disorder that happens in the luteal phase, so right after ovulation, right before menstruation starts. And the sort of thinking about this disorder is that in women who are affected, they have brains that are essentially abnormally sensitive to these hormonal shifts that happen during that phase of the cycle. And so they experience what we might think of as PMS symptoms to a greater degree. So things like depression, anxiety, insomnia, et cetera, but also can experience some other symptoms that don't typically show up in what you might think of as typical PMS, like rage or, extreme sort of physical symptoms. And so it's sort of, again, one of the one of those things that is hard to trace the origin, but there is some sort of biological support for the theory, which is that these hormones, estrogen and progesterone, interact with mast cells and that produces these effects in the brain on things like mood and anxiety. So there's, some fundamental physiological support. What there has not been so far is like rigorous research comparing these antihistamine approaches versus like standard of care or other pharmacological approaches to this condition. Essentially, what people have been doing is trying it, saying, "Whoa, that worked for me," and then sharing it. And then other people try it and report that it's worked. And so we're very much in the stage, I would say, of hypothesis generation. I'm not aware of anyone who like went out and wrote some comparative effectiveness proposal and got it funded since this idea started. And let us know, listeners, if you know some ongoing studies. But super interesting space, really speaks to what I would say is kind of historical under attention to women's health, specific domains of women's health, and an opportunity to address what's a really impactful sort of quality of life condition that could be, quite devastating. And so it'll be exciting if this makes it through some of the initial thinking for people who work in the space, and if there are actually studies done to see if this is more than just a placebo effect or sedation that leads to better sleep or something. There are lots of other mechanisms that could be responsible here. But I think we're going to probably find out more now that it's reached this level of people being aware of this as a potential strategy in a space where there's not a lot of evidence-based treatments available.
Yeah, and at least, like I said, I was like, "Oh, maybe the algorithm or maybe I'm not seeing it," but then once I started doing some reading and thinking about it for this, I started looking like, interestingly, again, things that we aren't often taught or we should be spending more time thinking about. The, like, spike of estrogen with histamine seems to go together, and it then makes sense that maybe there's some of the symptoms correlated to overexpression of histamine, antihistamines might play a role. So there's some biologic potential plausibility, as you said. There's a lot of people who are describing what they see or feel or hear. So it'd be great to get trials quickly done as we've started this conversation to say, how could we get to answers around patients and information here? Because it's clearly a space where you get a sense that a lot of people are engaged and there's a big unmet need that's not been studied. Like a lot of women's health issues, or, just as a side note, like the majority of financial research going on, unfortunately, doesn't identify these kinds of signals until something like this comes about. So to your point about our like innovation and episode, all the topics that we've talked about are putting things together that might not have existed before for a variety of reasons. And that's not a bad thing. Whether those signals can be identified through AI or can be captured for people to actually put rigorous science into practice would be great because talk about a faster evidence cycle, especially for the conditions we've talked about, everything from PMDD that you just mentioned to whether it was autoimmune disorders or PTSD and significant depression. I mean, there's just a lot here that we could be making a difference in people's lives. Again, talk about hitting the headlines, lots of anecdotal or other information out there. Hopefully, science follows quickly, or at least some versions of evaluation so that we can get a better handle on how to do it. Now, some will say, "But Manesh, super low risk." And I'm like, "You're right. Antihistamines have been on the market for a long time. My only problem is that every time we take one thing, there are other things that could happen. And I'd love to have science behind it so we're not perpetuating potentially taking things that could have a whole mass effect of other side effects that aren't helping people."
Yeah, I'd also like to hear your thoughts on this bigger question. You've been in research for a while, just decades and decades that you've spent perfecting your craft, just extensive expertise across generations, you might say.
Older, yeah.
So, I'm also talking about myself here, unfortunately, but you've seen a lot of things come and go. And this is a different era we're in where think about people kind of crowdsourcing this idea and sharing it on social media. And then I don't know, my guess is we are going to see some more kind of funding, at least proposals. I don't know if they'll be successful, but we'll see some activity in this space, I think. Like, how do you feel thinking about those? I mean, those are new pathways for hypotheses to make their way into the mainstream scientific community. You think that's mostly a good thing, mostly a bad thing, somewhere in between? How do you see that?
I would generally lean deeply into saying it's mostly a good thing. If anything, of course, there are multiple ways in which there are gonna be scientific questions or clinical questions, but, like, it's not different than saying, like, getting closer to the people we serve, right? If there are issues that are affecting people's lives, those are the ones we wanna answer. There are other issues sometimes that they don't know about or risks that people may not know about that, of course, we also have to study. So I don't wanna make it sound like it's only gonna be studying things that people are bringing to us broadly, but sometimes our aperture is too narrow and we sit and think about the questions that we think are so critical. Again, back to my many years, as you've highlighted, as a cardiovascular researcher, we may have focused too long on things that are so directly gonna make people not have a heart attack or not have a hospitalization. Those are really important for sure, but feeling better, being functionally better, having a better health span, those are all really critical too, as we're hearing, right? And so I think, we're evolving as a community, hopefully, of researchers, but as clinicians and probably I would just say as a health community thinking about that for people. And that doesn't mean that there's any perfect way, but I am still, again, like a glass half full person. I think the more voices you can have, if you can curate them to at least get a sense of it, that will help us understand the right questions and importance of those questions. That doesn't mean that biology and some of our own knowledge won't sometimes drive us in some other discovery areas. But for some of these associative symptoms, associative possible solutions, it's a great way to think about it, at least at the start.
Yeah, gatekeeping, at least now, that happens where people still take a close look and say, does this make sense? And is this a high priority area where there are evidence gaps and we really want to spend, say, tax dollars on these studies? Those processes are still very much in place to make sure that only, most kind of promising areas move forward. But it's good to see at least the idea and hypothesis generation part of the process being a little bit more democratic, a little bit more inclusive. So I think on the balance, it's a good change.
Yeah, look, we've come to the end of this episode on Beyond the Headlines, and we've covered quite a bunch of stuff, but it's been interesting because I really do think not just this episode as we're thinking about the way different innovations have occurred, but it speaks to actually the way Beyond the Endpoints evolved in season two here. I look back and go like, we've covered quite a bit of stuff, right? We've gone from autism to colorectal cancer awareness screening, AI in medicine, GLP-1s. You just mentioned Dr. Rubin and the allergies. I would have to say that we are broadening it and hopefully making people that are listening to us get a sense of how we think about science as science and research is evolving around these issues. But I don't know, Emily, was there a high point or a low point during season two here?
I feel like I learned so much. I really loved our episode on chronic back pain and sort of thinking of the biopsychosocial model and how there's no one size fits all approach, which I would say is maybe the common thread for all of our all of our episodes. I think more than anything, so many of our guests have emphasized this like humility and this learning mindset that, anytime you're at the core of one of these hot topic areas, there's a lot of opinions and there's still a lot to learn. And so it's about kind of reducing our uncertainty about a topic or a question over time and being willing to shift gears and refocus and innovate and use new methods, make sure that we're, reaching different populations. It's not an easy job, but I think most of the guests that we've had have really nicely laid out the excitement and the challenges equally so that we can see their thought process, how they tackle something really complex. Tyler trying to train, I forget the goal, 50,000, 100,000, lots of people in one day with CPR. It's been really cool to see the way that people are bringing science directly into communities and also hear them talk about the caveats and what we still don't know, what isn't quite ready for prime time. So it's been a really fun season.
Yeah, I think the exciting part for me has been one, just seeing how different people think about stuff, right? Like part of hopefully what people are getting out of this podcast, and we continue to want your feedback. So make sure you give it to us. We're going to keep evolving. Is the curiosity of how we learn and how people learn and how they think about things. That is at the core of this. It's like the excitement about thinking about how people learn, but then human stories. The stories you said about whether it's like trying to train a bunch of people to do CPR or catching colon cancer at the right time and why you need to be thinking about it and how it can affect so many lives. And so, whether it's the stories we talked about today or the others, we're just really excited that you're listening and we appreciate you. Please be sure to come back for season 3 in August. I'm a Leo. I like long walks on the beach. I'm born in August, so I'm excited for you to join us then. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Headlines, a recurring series here on the podcast. We encourage you to share any headlines that have caught your eye by emailing us at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu.
And for the record, I'm a Gemini. Don't forget to subscribe on SoundCloud, Spotify, Amazon Music, or Apple Podcasts. You can also connect with the Duke Clinical Research Institute on LinkedIn or by following at DCRI News on X and Blue Sky. We hope you join us for season 3 of Beyond the Endpoint and have a great summer.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.